If you picture the Maldives, you probably, see a luxury overwater bungalow with a glass floor.
Right, the classic postcard image.
Exactly. Maybe a private plunge pool and incredibly clear turquoise water. But what you almost certainly do not see is a nation orchestrating like one of the most frantic, high-stakes economic and social miracles in modern human history.
Yeah, and all while the ocean literally threatens to swallow it whole.
Right. So today, we're tearing up the travel brochure.
It's a necessary shift in perspective, I think, because the gap between the global perception of the Maldives as this tranquil, static paradise and the operational reality of the country is just staggering.
It really is.
Beneath that carefully curated surface is a highly complex, fiercely active machinery of survival.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission, with you joining us, is to look under the hood of what economists call the blue economy.
Very fitting term.
Right. And we are drawing from an incredibly comprehensive data report spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023. It's titled Maldives, From Resource Dependence to Service-Led Transformation.
And we're also pulling from a massive stack of macroeconomic data from the World Bank to really ground this.
Exactly. We want to understand how a tiny island nation pulled off this developmental miracle and look at the existential threats it's navigating right now. We'll be hitting four main pillars today.
Which are the volatile economic engine, the paradox of their macro finances, the human capital revolution, and, well, the ultimate environmental ticking clock.
Yeah. So I've been looking over these numbers, and I keep coming back to the fundamental geography. Like, how do you even begin to build a modern economy when your entire country is roughly the size of, I don't know, the city limits of Little Rock, Arkansas, but shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces?
You really can't overstate that. The physical constraints are the defining feature of their entire national story. I mean, we are talking about a total land area of just 298 square kilometers.
That's nothing.
It's tiny. And as you mentioned, that land isn't a solid block. It's fractured across over 1,000 coral islands, spread out over roughly 90,000 square kilometers of the Indian Ocean.
Which is just a logistical nightmare.
Absolutely. And in 1960, the data shows the population living on those scattered islands was around 91,000 people.
Mostly relying on subsistence fishing, right? Like very isolated communities.
You're primarily fishing, yeah. It was a traditional, highly localized way of life. There was virtually no natural resource wealth in the traditional sense.
Right, no timber or anything.
No timber, no massive mineral deposits, and certainly no large-scale agricultural soil. But fast forward to 2022, and that population has surged to roughly 521,000.
Wow.
You have population multiplying more than 5 times over, and they're demanding modern infrastructure, healthcare, education on essentially zero land.
Which makes the gross domestic product numbers look like a misprint.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1980, the GDP of the Maldives was sitting around $180 million.
Which is very small.
Very small. But by 2023, and this is tracking in 2015 constant prices to account for inflation, by the way, it skyrocketed to $6.227 billion.
It's a massive jump.
That is exponential hyper-accelerated growth. But, a country with no land can't build massive car factories or steel mills. They can't grow vast fields of wheat. So how did they actually generate that wealth?
Well, they did the only logical thing available to them. They monetized their geography.
Monetize the isolation.
Exactly. If your only assets are isolation, coral reefs, and a tropical climate, you turn the ocean into your primary export. The national economy fundamentally reorganized itself around the service sector.
Specifically high-end tourism.
Right. And by 2023, services accounted for an astounding 80% of the entire economy. That's about $4.936 billion out of their $6.2 billion GDP.
While the rest of the economy barely registers in comparison. I mean, industry sits at around 518 million, and agriculture is almost non-existent at 271 million.
It's just a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. Even fishing, which was the absolute backbone of the Maldivian way of life for centuries, has been entirely marginalized. The data tracks fishing output growing steadily until it peaked around 2005, but today it's completely dwarfed.
Which creates a highly unique, deeply vulnerable economic profile. Tourism was undeniably the most efficient path to pull the nation out of poverty, but
It comes with a catch.
a huge catch. It forces a hyperdependency on global factors far beyond their control. They are entirely reliant on international tourists maintaining a certain level of disposable income.
And on the global aviation network actually operating without interruption.
Precisely.
It makes me think of an analogy. Looking at their macroeconomic structure, it's like the Maldives is a high-performance sports car, but the transmission is permanently welded into a single gear.
Yeah, the services and tourism gear.
Exactly. When you're on a straightaway, when the global economy is booming and people are flying, that car goes incredibly fast. It's exhilarating.
Right, the money is pouring in.
But the moment you hit a sharp turn or a speed bump, say a global financial crisis,
Yeah.
you risk stalling out completely because you physically cannot downshift into manufacturing or agriculture to keep moving.
That is an incredibly apt way to visualize the structural risk. And the report gives us a perfect, albeit brutal, case study of what happens when that car hits a wall.
2020.
Yes, 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic effectively shut down global international travel. Because the Maldives couldn't downshift, their GDP plunged by a devastating 34.8% in a single year.
A 35% contraction is apocalyptic for most nations. I mean, think about your own personal finances or a small business you might run being 80% reliant on a single client.
It's terrifying.
It really is. When that client is buying, you're living large. But the anxiety of knowing that if they paused their orders for 6 months, you are instantly facing ruin, that's the daily reality of the Maldivian national budget.
It is a precarious position. However, the data from the very next year reveals something crucial about the nature of their specific product. In 2021, they posted an incredible V-shaped recovery with a 33.8% growth rate.
Just bouncing right back.
Exactly. They were one of the first nations to figure out how to safely reopen their borders, utilizing their geographic isolation, that one island, one resort model, as a natural quarantine feature.
Oh, that's clever.
It really was. And it proved that the global demand for luxury isolation is highly resilient. People desperately wanted to go there, and as soon as they could, the money flooded back in.
So you have this incredibly powerful, yet highly fragile economic engine. But here's the logistical puzzle that fascinates me. They don't produce much of what they physically need to survive.
Virtually nothing.
Right. If you fly to a resort in the Maldives and order a club sandwich, the wheat for the bread, the chicken, the tomatoes, none of that was grown there.
No, it was all imported.
And the massive diesel generators powering the air conditioning for your overwater bungalow are burning fuel that had to be shipped across an ocean. So how do they actually manage the mechanics of getting all this physical stuff to run a $6 billion service economy?
Well, that leads directly into their trade profile, which is one of the most extreme in the world. Because they must import almost everything required to sustain a modern population and build ultra-luxury infrastructure, they operate in a radically open trade environment.
How open we're talking?
The data shows their trade in goods and services sits between 140% to 160% of their GDP.
Wow. To put that in perspective for you listening, most large diversified economies sit somewhere around 20 to 30%.
Exactly.
So a trade openness of 160% means the Maldivian economy is inextricably wired into global supply chains at all times.
What's fascinating here is that because they are importing heavy, expensive physical goods like construction materials, jet fuel, food, and primarily exporting an intangible service, the experience of a vacation, they run a chronic systemic current account deficit.
Let's break that down for a second. A current account deficit essentially means a country is importing more goods, services, and capital than it's exporting, right?
Yes.
So they are bleeding foreign currency because the physical cost of keeping the country running is higher than the cash coming in from the resorts.
And the margins aren't small. The report notes this deficit hit a historical low of negative 52.3% of their GDP in 2008.
Negative 52%.
Yeah, and even in relatively stable years, it runs deeply in the red.
Okay, but if you're spending more than you're making year over year to build these airports and resorts, someone has to be footing that massive bill. Where is all this capital coming from?
It comes through aggressive borrowing and international aid. To finance this rapid modernization, central government debt has risen sharply, particularly from 2010 onwards.
So they're taking on a lot of debt.
A lot. They issue sovereign bonds, they secure bilateral loans. Additionally, official development assistance, or ODA, plays a massive role.
And that's aid from other countries, right?
Right. Aid and concessional loans from foreign governments and international bodies. In 2022 alone, ODA to the Maldives reached $280 million.
Let me push back on this a bit, though. We just established that they have a GDP of over $6 billion. They are bringing in massive amounts of revenue from high-end tourism.
True.
So why does a country that wealthy on paper need hundreds of millions in development assistance? Is this debt profile ticking time bomb? Or is it just the unavoidable cost of doing business when you're building a modern nation in the middle of the ocean?
It's definitely the latter. It's less about mismanagement and more about the immense upfront cost of artificial geography. The Maldives is essentially borrowing against its future tourism revenues to build the physical infrastructure required to survive today.
Because they can't just build on existing land.
Exactly. When you need a new airport runway, you can't just pave over an empty field. You have to literally dredge sand from the ocean floor, build a new artificial island, stabilize it, and then build the runway.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That requires billions in upfront capital that simply doesn't exist in their domestic tax base. They have to borrow it.
So it's analogous to taking out a massive commercial mortgage to build a luxury hotel. The debt load looks terrifying on the balance sheet, but as long as the rooms stay fully booked at top dollar, you can service the debt.
Precisely. But that circles us right back to the vulnerability of the single-gear economy. If another global shock occurs and the rooms don't stay booked, servicing that debt becomes an immediate existential crisis.
Because the buffer is just so thin.
Exactly. Because the margins for error are so incredibly thin, the stability of their government institutions becomes paramount. International lenders need to know the country is stable enough to pay them back.
And the report actually tracks this, right? Using the Worldwide Governance Indicators, the WGI.
Yes, it does.
And looking strictly at the institutional data, and we are looking at this purely as an impartial metric of regulatory health here, you can see a fascinating correlation.
The WGI data demonstrates that overall, the Maldives has managed to maintain the baseline institutional stability required to keep international capital flowing.
Which is key for those loans.
Right. However, it also highlights significant historical fluctuations in areas like regulatory quality, political stability, and corruption control.
And what the timeline shows is that these governance metrics are incredibly sensitive to those external economic shocks we talked about earlier.
They absolutely are.
When global tourism dips and the national budget gets squeezed, the political and regulatory friction inside the country spikes almost immediately.
It is a classic stress response in a developing system. I mean, managing an economy growing at this breakneck speed while juggling massive infrastructure debt and managing global supply chains, it requires flawless bureaucratic execution.
And when the economy contracts, the pressure on those institutions is just immense.
Immense.
So we have this picture of a nation walking a macroeconomic tightrope. They're heavily indebted, entirely reliant on imports, and functioning on a single industry. But here is the pivot that completely changes the narrative.
The human capital.
Exactly. The wealth they generated didn't just vanish into offshore bank accounts or empty monuments. The data proves it was fundamentally aggressively reinvested into the Maldivian people.
The demographic and health transformation of the Maldives over the last 60 years is arguably one of the most successful, rapid public health triumphs in human history.
It's wild to look at.
It is a complete rewrite of their social fabric.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I saw the life expectancy numbers and genuinely thought I was misreading the chart. Let's look at 1960. The life expectancy in the Maldives was 38.2 years.
Which is heartbreakingly low.
It really is.
It reflects a society that was deeply burdened by infectious diseases, a lack of clean water, and the severe geographic isolation of those remote atolls from any form of advanced medical care.
But jump to 2022. That number didn't just creep up. It saw a staggering leap to 81.0 years.
Unbelievable progress.
They more than doubled the lifespan of their entire citizenry in just 2 generations. How do you physically execute a public health miracle of that scale across 1,000 islands?
It required a highly coordinated, centralized effort funded by that early tourism revenue. The government systematically built out a hub-and-spoke healthcare model.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, they invested in rural clinics for basic care on the outer atolls, centralized hospitals and urban centers, aggressive nationwide vaccination programs, and, crucially, clean water and sanitation infrastructure.
Right, getting the basics handled.
Exactly. The infant mortality rate plummeted, and the rate of skilled birth attendance, meaning a trained medical professionals present during childbirth, is now practically 100%.
100%.
Practically, yes. They lead the entire South Asian region in these metrics.
And this health miracle triggered a massive demographic shift. In 1960, the birth rate was 51.2 per 1,000 people. Families were having a lot of children, largely because childhood mortality was so high.
Right, it's a common demographic pattern.
But as healthcare improved and children survived, the birth rate plummeted. By 2022, it was down to just 11.0.
A huge drop.
Yeah, and as a direct result, the percentage of the population aged 0 to 14 shrank from over 40% to about 20%.
Which brings us to a critical economic concept, the demographic dividend.
Right.
Because the birth rate dropped so dramatically, but the adults who are already born are aging into the workforce, you end up with a massive bulge in the middle of your population pyramid.
The workers.
Exactly. Today, the working age population in the Maldives, those between 15 and 64 years old, is at a historical high of 79.2%.
Let's break down what a demographic dividend actually feels like on a family level. Yeah. Imagine a Maldivian family in the 1970s. The parents are feeding, clothing, and housing 6 children on perhaps a single fishing income.
Every ounce of resource goes toward basic daily survival.
Exactly. Now imagine that same family structure in 2022. The couple has 1 or 2 children, but both parents might have earning power. Suddenly, they aren't just surviving, they have surplus cash.
They can save.
They can invest, they can buy consumer goods. When you multiply that sudden financial surplus across an entire nation at the exact same time, it creates a massive explosion of economic energy.
That is exactly how the demographic dividend fuels GDP growth. You have a massive labor force ready to work and families with the disposable income to drive domestic consumption.
But as with everything in this report, solving one monumental problem simply unlocks a brand new, more complex challenge.
Yes, the public health paradox.
The whiplash of modernization. Because they cured the diseases of poverty so quickly, they immediately crashed headfirst into the diseases of affluence.
The data on mortality causes is stark. As that basic healthcare infrastructure conquered communicable infectious diseases, which now account for only 8.2% of all deaths, by the way, a new threat emerged.
The non-communicable diseases.
Right, NCDs. These are conditions like heart disease, stroke, cancer, and diabetes. Today, NCDs have skyrocketed to account for 85.2% of all deaths in the Maldives.
It's the biological consequence of their economic shift. I mean, you have a population that transitioned in a historical blink of an eye from a highly active, physically demanding fishing lifestyle eating local protein to a modern, sedentary, service-based society importing processed foods and sugars.
And the public health system now has to pivot. Building a clinic to administer vaccines is relatively straightforward.
Sure.
But managing a nationwide chronic diabetes epidemic among a population that is now living into their 80s, that requires a vastly more expensive, sustained, and specialized medical infrastructure.
Which is a huge strain on resources.
Huge. Furthermore, the report points out a lingering nutritional paradox. Despite the wealth and the closing of sanitation gaps between urban and rural islands, childhood stunting remains an issue, existing side by side with rising rates of adult obesity.
That's wild. Stunting and obesity at the same time.
Yeah, it illustrates that nutritional education hasn't entirely caught up with the sudden availability of imported calories.
It's fascinating. You keep everyone alive to 81, which is incredible, but now you have to figure out what to do with them. You have this booming, healthy, working-age population.
And you need to educate them.
Right. The logical next step is to educate them to run this high-end economy. But when we look at the data surrounding education and the labor market, we hit a massive structural contradiction.
We do. The educational achievements initially mirror the health successes. The government poured resources into schooling. Today, the Maldives has achieved near universal primary education.
Almost everyone is going to school.
Yes. When you look at youth literacy for those aged 15 to 24, it is over 99.7%.
That's incredible. And the government spending backed this up, right? The proportion of trained primary school teachers rose from 60% to over 86%.
Yes, and crucially, this wasn't just directed at men. The Gender Parity Index, or GPI, tracks the ratio of female to male enrollment. Across primary, secondary, and tertiary education, the GPI in the Maldives is near or above 1.0.
That means young women are equally, if not slightly more, educated than young men. They are graduating high school, they are getting university degrees.
So on paper, the human capital pipeline looks flawless. You have a highly literate, educated, gender-equal generation ready to power the economy. But here is where the data reveals a severe disconnect. Despite equal educational outcomes, female labor force participation is stuck between 40% and 48%. Less than half. Meanwhile, male participation is operating at 75 to 80%.
Why? I mean, why is an economy that successfully produces highly educated young women failing so drastically to absorb them into the workforce? Where is the friction?
Well, the friction lies in the physical geography of their single-gear economy. Remember, 80% of the economy is tourism.
Right.
And in the Maldives, tourism operates almost exclusively on that one island, one resort model.
Oh, I see where this is going.
These luxury hotels aren't built in downtown residential neighborhoods where you can just commute on a bus. They are built on isolated, entirely separate islands.
It's like building a world-class university in your hometown, graduating a stellar class of business and hospitality majors. But the only companies hiring require you to live on an offshore oil rig for 6 months out of the year.
That analogy perfectly captures the structural barrier. To work in the primary industry of the Maldives, an employee usually has to leave their home island, leave their family, and live in staff dormitories on a resort island.
Which is a huge ask.
Exactly. For a young, educated woman in a society with traditional cultural norms regarding family care, marriage, and community ties, the social and logistical barriers to moving to a resort island are immense.
So even though she has a degree in management or finance, she is effectively locked out of the main economic engine because of where the engine is physically located.
Unfortunately, yes. And the data shows this mismatch isn't just affecting women. Youth unemployment in general shows structural differences, meaning that even educated young men struggle to secure the top-tier management jobs at these resorts, which are frequently filled by expatriate labor imported by the international hotel chains.
Ah, so they're bringing in outside management instead of hiring locally.
Often, yes.
It represents a massive inefficiency. I mean, the government spent decades and millions of dollars cultivating this incredible human capital, but they're trying to force it all through the narrow, geographically restrictive funnel of resort hospitality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly why the strategic recommendations in the report heavily emphasize the critical need for economic diversification.
Specifically through digitalization.
Precisely.
Because if you can build a robust digital economy, remote IT services, digital finance, global tech support, you instantly bypass the geographic barrier.
Exactly. An educated woman wouldn't need to leave her community to live in a resort dormitory. She could work for the global market right from her laptop on her home island.
Which solves the mismatch.
Yes. Digitalization allows them to utilize their human capital investment without relying on the physical movement of bodies across the ocean. It creates a second gear for the economy.
Which is brilliant. But as we look at the final section of this report, we have to acknowledge the devastating reality looming over everything we've just discussed.
The climate data.
Right. All of this progress, the $6 billion economy, the doubled life expectancy, the schools, the digital ambitions, it's all playing out on a stage that is systematically being erased.
The environmental sustainability data is the existential core of the Maldivian story. As their economy modernized, their environmental footprint naturally grew. Greenhouse gas emissions rose from 0.22 megatons of CO2 equivalent in 1990 to 3.97 megatons in 2021.
Let's be honest, though. On a global scale, 3.97 megatons is a microscopic rounding error.
It is?
It's virtually nothing compared to the industrial output of North America, Europe, or China.
It is statistically insignificant globally. However, the report also tracks their adjusted savings metrics.
What does that mean?
Think of a national economy like a bank account. You are depositing massive amounts of cash from tourism. But adjusted savings looks at what you are quietly withdrawing from your natural environment to get that cash. Depleting freshwater aquifers, burning imported fossil fuels, degrading coral reefs through dredging for those artificial islands. The rapid development is consuming their localized natural capital at a concerning rate.
But the tragic, undeniable irony of the Maldives is that while their contribution to global climate change is basically zero, they are positioned to be the very first sovereign nation to pay the ultimate price for the rest of the world's industrialization.
It is a devastating reality.
The most terrifying data point in this entire 60-year analysis is this. 43.7% of the rural population of the Maldives lives in areas that are less than 5 meters above sea level.
5 meters is roughly 16 feet. And to be clear, 5 meters is the absolute high end.
Right.
The vast majority of the country's landmass averages just 1.5 meters above sea level.
I want you to really think about what that means. Depending on where you live, climate change might feel like a threat multiplier. It makes hurricane seasons worse, or it lengthens a wildfire season.
It exacerbates existing problems.
Right. It's a serious problem, but it's an intensification of existing weather. For the Maldives, sea level rise isn't a future abstraction or a political talking point. It is geography dictating their physical destiny right now.
Right now.
A rise of just a few centimeters contaminates the freshwater lenses beneath the islands, destroying agriculture. A few more centimeters, and the islands simply cease to exist. So what does this all mean?
It means they are the ultimate bellwether for the global climate crisis. Because they are on the absolute front lines, the report outlines 3 simultaneous paths they must execute to survive.
Okay, what are they?
Well, we've discussed the first, economic diversification through digitalization. The second path is the green transition.
And the Maldives has pledged to aggressively cut its reliance on imported fossil fuels, transitioning heavily to renewable energy, primarily solar. Right.
They have. And we must emphasize that for the Maldives, a green transition is not merely about environmental public relations. It is a cold, hard, fiscal necessity.
Right. Think back to that massive current account deficit we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
A huge percentage of the money bleeding out of the country goes toward purchasing the diesel fuel required to run the generators on all those scattered resort islands.
Exactly.
If they can power those islands with solar energy, they aren't just reducing their microscopic carbon footprint. They're plugging a massive bleeding hole in their national budget. It is an economic survival strategy disguised as an environmental one.
That's perfectly stated. Ecology and macroeconomics are entirely indistinguishable in this context, which leads to the third path the report outlines, fiscal resilience.
Meaning managing that debt.
Yes, they have to restructure their debt and build larger national financial buffers. As climate impacts accelerate, the frequency and severity of external shocks will increase.
They'll need cash on hand.
They will need immediate access to massive amounts of capital simply to adapt, to build higher seawalls, to physically elevate inhabited islands, to protect their critical infrastructure from storm surges.
It's a staggering, almost overwhelming set of challenges. Okay, let's zoom out and look at the whole board.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. We've explored a nation of over 1,000 tiny islands that effectively hacked the global tourism market to pull its people out of poverty. They built a multi-billion-dollar economic engine from scratch.
They did.
They took that wealth and executed a public health miracle, doubling the lifespans of their citizens and wiping out infectious diseases. They educated an entire generation of men and women to near-perfect literacy.
Yet the bill for that hyper-accelerated progress is coming due. They are navigating a heavy, complex debt burden, a highly vulnerable single-industry economy, a labor market physically structured to exclude its educated women, and above all, the relentless, accelerating threat of the rising ocean.
It has to be the most complex high-wire act of any government on Earth.
This raises an important question, one that is deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If the worst-case climate models hold true over the coming decades, and the physical land of the Maldives becomes fundamentally uninhabitable, what actually happens to the nation?
And that brings us to a final, slightly provocative thought I had while reading through their strategic goals.
Oh.
It's not explicitly mapped out in the economic data, but it feels like the logical, perhaps inevitable conclusion of their current trajectory. The report strongly pushes for economic diversification through digitalization. Right.
Yes, it does.
We talked about utilizing their highly educated, digitally literate youth to build an economy independent of physical resorts.
A necessary shift to solve the labor mismatch, yes.
But what if that digitalization isn't just an economic strategy? What if it's the foundation of a continuity of government strategy?
How do you mean?
If the physical coral atolls are eventually lost to the sea, could the Maldives, with its massive investments in a highly educated, universally connected population, become the world's first true cloud nation?
A sovereign entity that exists legally, culturally, and economically entirely independent of a physical territorial landmass.
Exactly. A national economy, a distinct culture, a globalized workforce, and a recognized government that exists digitally, sustained by the incredible human capital they are building right this second. Even to the islands they currently call home are submerged.
That's a profound thought.
It sounds like science fiction, but when you look at the sheer survival instinct documented in this 60-year data report, they are already laying the digital and educational groundwork for it. It's something for you to mull over the next time you see a screensaver of those perfect overwater bungalows.
The postcard is beautiful, but the reality of their survival is genuinely awe-inspiring.
It really is. The historical evolution of the Maldives defies any simple categorization.
It is a testament to human adaptability under extreme geographic constraints.
Absolutely. Well,
Wow.
thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the blue economy. Keep questioning the postcard, and we'll catch you next time.